So it's another beautiful day in Southern California, one of those days that you know why you came here and want to enjoy the sun. And this is a talk about setting up an orchard and pruning fruit trees in the orchard here. Southern California is completely different from the rest of the country. Today is about the start of spring. You can see it actually if you look in your garden and you see the buds in a peach or a nectarine start to swell, then you know that spring is there. And spring is when the sap flow starts. So we are much earlier here than the rest of the country. And it also means that some things that hold true for the rest of the country don't hold true here. For example, in places in the Midwest, it's not unusual to have 1,000 chill hours, meaning hours below 65 degrees prior to mid-December. Out here, if we get 200 chill hours, we're lucky. So many times you see trees here that just don't grow well. And when you go to a nursery, especially some of the big places, not like an Armstrong, you see them sell trees that you know will fail here. So again, things to look for. And of course, you're all familiar with what being in a garden does, how good it feels, but also how if you are pained by any thoughts of depression or loneliness, there's nothing better than becoming active, going for a bike ride, working in the garden, feeling a plant, crushing a leaf, smelling the fragrance of a flower. All of those are perfectly valid things, so they work here. So now you see here a small orchard that we planted some 6 years ago as teeny tiny trees. There is no right or wrong way to plant an orchard or to prune a tree. There are several appropriate ways. Here we went for trees that we keep on the small side, where this is before pruning, but after pruning you can stand on the ground and just pick the fruit. But when I did my fruit tree pruning exam, which by now is over 50 years ago in the Netherlands, it was in freezing cold, and we were pruning apple trees that were 25 feet tall and 25 feet wide. And that was then considered excellent orchard setup. So the ideas change, but not how you take care of the trees once you have your setup. I get asked many times to come out and prune trees, and I will prune small fruit trees. I don't climb trees any longer. But to prune a tree that has not been pruned, it's a nightmare. It takes hours to establish some order in the overall. Whereas if you have an established shape, and I will show some of those, then it's a breeze going through the pruning, knowing what to do, where to go. The whole process is much shorter and much more efficient. One of the interesting things about arboriculture is that we are learning a lot from the trees themselves. Now we know that there is such a thing as an underground wide web, that there are fungi which work their way either around the roots of the tree or inside the roots, and they share tasks. The way they set this up some 400 million years ago is that the trees make sugars, just taking carbon dioxide and some sunshine and some moisture, and transform those into sugars. Part of those they use to feed themselves, part to feed the branches in the tree, part goes to the trunk, and part goes to the roots. And another part goes to the roots, to the fungi that feed the roots. So there is a whole intricate system, much more so than we ever were aware of. And the trees pay a tax of about 30% of their sugars goes directly to the fungi. In return, the fungus, the mycorrhizae, hunt for phosphorus, nitrogen, and other elements, for water, fend off any insects that dare come close. So that's part of it. And at the transition points where the sugar from the tree goes into the fungus, there is a lot of leakage. And at those places, imagine an underground jungle with literally billions of microorganisms sitting there, feeding at the trough, having a grand old time. It all happens in dark, it's completely silent, and yet it's the biggest underground jungle you can imagine. So there is tremendous activity underground going on all the time. Trees have no brains, but that doesn't mean that they can't function rationally, because they do. It's amazing when you see a tree in action. It decides beforehand if an action is beneficial, the tree will do it. So trees actually come to each other's defense through the fungi, the mycorrhizae, and so trees take care of themselves and the other trees around, strictly based on self-interest. So we could learn a lot just from how to cooperate, regardless of whether you like or dislike your partner, doesn't matter. If it's in their interest, they'll do it. So that's what we're seeing more and more. And we know that trees can live for a long time. Some live over 100 years, even fruit trees. So we have to take good care of them. And so let's look at the elements of the orchard. And I have a lot of information and I need to go through it very fast because it's so much, because typically I devote a couple of hours just to that information in the beginning. So we need an orchard, we need some soil. And soil actually is one of the most important things. Once you have planted your trees, it's very hard to change the soil. It's much, much easier to do it beforehand, to incorporate enough in enough organic material in the soil that that you are guaranteed a good outcome. And we have some things working against us. Yes, there is a drought every once in a while, so now we had some rain, but there's still a drought. There is the COVID epidemic that makes life a little harder. There is global warming that may wipe us out unless we do something about it. And there is the water supply, and unfortunately we get a lot of our water here from the Colorado River, which is very salty. So when you look at avocados, for example, or other trees, citrus trees to a lesser extent, you'll see that the edges turn brown. That's just because the leaf is sacrificing the outer layer because it's just too salty to operate in an environment like that. So, very quickly going through soil. A good soil consists of different particles, and in an exaggerated form, soil consists of sand, silt, and clay. And sand particles look like this in the soil, huge. Silt is like this, and clay are teeny tiny particles. And so they fit together. In between those particles of different sizes, there is a lot of open space, a lot of minerals. A lot of open space, so that half of soil is mineral and the other half is air or water, as the case may be. If later on, when we take a break and you walk through the orchard, you will feel that your steps actually bounce off the soil. And that is what you want to experience in a good soil, that yes, there is that bouncing feeling. That is what good soil feels like. And good soil looks like chocolate cake. You want to see something that is that dark and smells that rich. And then the triangle for soil texture, sand, silt, and clay are only names for different sizes of particles, but the different sizes carry different characteristics with them. Then, I'm not going to go through all of this information, be it enough that underground there are literally billions of microorganisms of the most varied kinds, and you see one fierce war after another being fought. You see microorganisms working together, fighting, some eating each other. One being's waste is another being's dinner. So just that you're aware that there's a lot of complicated transactions going on, and the more you have of those in the soil, typically the better the quality of the soil. And again, that is something that's very hard to establish in an existing orchard. If you can do that beforehand, if you can work your soil, so much the better. There's another factor, that if you spade a soil or work it with a rototiller or anything like that, you do a lot of damage to the soil. Eventually that will get corrected again, but you try to avoid it after the beginning. So in the beginning, if you need to add organic material, fine. Do everything you need to do, and thereafter try not to work the soil any longer. Okay, again, I'll try and do this as fast as I can. When to prune, how to prune, the benefits you get. The important thing to consider is that you decide how you want your tree to look. You decide which tree to select. You decide how to set up your orchard. There is no set rule. There are some recommended guidelines, but that's completely up to you. If you don't mind climbing in a tree, nothing that says you can't have a tree that's 35 feet tall and 30 feet wide. If you like to be a little more careful and say, hey, I'm getting up in age and I don't want to climb, I want to stand on the ground, okay, you keep your trees short and squat. All perfectly fine. When you decide to set up your orchard, it would be great if you could actually taste the fruit before buying the tree. Not that particular tree, but many garden associations, garden clubs invite people over for taste the fruit days. I wouldn't plant a tree unless I had some good idea of what the fruit tasted like. So I recommend, if you can, do so. Then, here in California, we get a nursery industry that's used to high production, but that puts trees in a very small can. So that poor root system barely has had any time to spread out. So you have to try and make the best you can. On the other hand, if you buy a big tree, that usually doesn't do as well as a little tree. So typically you're best off buying a 15-gallon or a 25-gallon or a bare root tree and not plant a big tree unless you have a big ego and it pleases you to see a big tree in your garden. So I taught you already different trees for different parts of the country. Then you have to decide what rootstock is the tree grafted on. When you look at this apricot here, you see that bulge about 14 inches up from the bottom. And that is because that tree, like most fruit trees, is grafted on a rootstock which is a different kind of tree than the top, because it has desirable qualities. So that's perfectly fine. And if you are lucky and if your people working in the nursery did a perfect job, there would be almost no marked transition between rootstock and top. Unfortunately, most of the time you'll see a definite, sometimes the rootstock is bigger, sometimes the top is wider. This shouldn't happen, but this happens a lot. So be prepared for that. With your rootstock, you have a lot of choices of what size of tree you want, and if you have any particular diseases in the soil that you want to take care of. So ask the nursery why they have the rootstock that they do. Then you, once you have prepared that soil and it's in great condition, make sure that you keep it covered, except for right next to the trunk. Every year you want a layer of mulch 3 or 4 inches thick on top of that soil, because that will gradually get incorporated in the soil, and that'll help increase the microorganisms in the soil. In general, trees don't like if you all of a sudden start whacking them down. If you take off more than, say, 25% of a tree, the tree typically will react and say, hey, I don't care for that. If you do that to a citrus tree, the orange or lemon or lime may actually burn, because it's more than the tree can bear. So you're much better off doing some light prunings a couple of times a year than one heavy pruning all at once. And the younger the tree, the harder you can prune, and the tree doesn't mind. The older the tree, can I say, just like us people, the more it gets its own peculiarities, and the less you can mess with it. So a little pruning in winter, a little pruning in summer is a good division. Now we're going to take a look at the fruiting habits, and you all got a handout. Every tree is different where it establishes the fruiting buds. So you can see beforehand, this apricot, for example, has many buds close together. These are the fruiting buds. On the other hand, if you have something like a nectarine, you see the individual buds here. And if you were to let these trees grow, if you didn't prune them at all, you would get a lot of new growth vertical, because all the branches tend to grow towards the light, but you wouldn't get that much fruit. So you'd have to know, how do I prune? In the case of the peach and the nectarine, you cut 1/3 to 1/2 of each and every fruiting branch off. And this tree has its fruiting buds on last year's growth, whereas an apricot has its fruit, bears its fruit on short-lived fruit buds, on spurs that live between 2 and 4 years' time. So the difference in pruning is that with a peach or a nectarine, you prune 1/3 to 1/2 of every single branch, and here you refresh 1/4 of all the budwood every year. And the reason that that's important, before you start pruning, you should have a plan ready that says, I'm gonna go in the garden and I will go with the shape, and we'll talk about the shape in a moment, but I want to take off X amount of wood, say 20%, and I will have it divided evenly over the tree. So you do all of that before you even have touched the tree. If you employ a gardener and the gardener comes and says, I'll prune the tree, I know what to do, it's perfectly all right to ask, so what is it you're going to do? And if the gardener cannot tell you that, then you might have to look for another gardener. So you have your handout to refer to that. Here is the peach or nectarine, and I indicated, so you cut 1/3 to 1/2 off of every branch. And this is different for each and every tree. And that's something you just have to learn. So then you tell yourself, oh, I'm probably going to take off 25% of all the wood in the tree. And you have decided what shape you're going to give your tree. And hopefully your tools are sharp and well oiled. And now we get to the recommended shapes that you can give your tree. And the two main shapes are the central leader and the open vase or the open center. With the central leader, you have one central trunk in the middle and side branches coming every which way. With the open vase, the center of the tree is open. So this is a triangle in reverse, and this is a triangle with a point on top. And some trees like one shape better than another. Apples and pears do just fine with central leader, whereas peaches and nectarines are great with open vase. So here you see in a bit more detail the central leader. You try and make sure that everything in the tree is pyramidal. So the base of the tree is wider than the top. The bottom branches are wider and longer than the branches up higher. That's a general rule, because the tree wants to grow at the top. Trees are very interesting. They are I don't know what kind of governmental form you would indicate, but the branches work together, but there is no overall ruler in a tree. So each branch works for the common good to some extent, but also works for itself. So the ones at the top, if they have a chance, they will try and overtake the ones at the bottom. So you don't let them, because that's not in your interest. Some little things like leaving little feathers on the trunk, because they help the trunk build up strength. So as opposed to the central leader, the open vase has between 3 and 5 main branches, but you keep the center open. And again, you keep the branches tapered, wider at the bottom than at the top. You try not to have branches directly opposed to each other, but always offset a little, because that is structurally a stronger type of juncture. But then there is many other shapes that are typically not used that much in California. But you have the pyramid, which is looks very much like a central leader, and you can prune trees as a cordon, whereby you have a single pole with very short side branches, even leaning. It looks ridiculous, but they bear a lot of fruit. And if it's up straight, you call it a pillar. And then the modified central leader and any type of multi-trunk tree. As long as you make sure that each and every branch, each and every trunk has its own room, and you can see it when you walk in a orchard. Every tree you see should be a strictly logical experience. If you see, oh yes, this is a pruned as an open vase, and here are the three main branches, and so forth, terrific. If you do not see a structure in a tree, then the pruner did not do as good a job. Then there's also fun with espaliers, which are flat, usually against a southern wall, and again you make the bottom branches longer and thicker than the ones at the top, but the tree will want to do the very opposite. So each and every year you walk through your orchard several times and you make sure that you maintain this type of order. Then, and I won't get into too much of that, but the way you make a cut is important too. Where you make a cut, you don't leave little stubs. You, in a case like this here, where you see that little thickening of the branch, just at that point you make the cut. You can see the tree will tell you if you made your cut the right way, because it will start making a new ring of callus growth exactly where you cut the branch. If that callus growth isn't there, then you didn't do a good job. And then when you cut next to a bud, because the bud will direct the growth of the branch, you want to have it right next to the bud, not too high up and not too low. Okay, I apologize for rushing through, but that's to give you an idea of what you're looking for when you start pruning a tree. Yes, question?
Can you say something about topping versus pruning?
Topping is a horrible practice. It's when you top, you cut regardless of where you make the cut, and you leave big pieces of branch without a bud, so the branch will die back to the nearest bud, and you'll get, if you're lucky, you get a lot of reaction by the tree, and if you're not lucky, you get a lot of dieback. So topping is not something you ever want to do in a fruit tree. Yes?
I have Fijoya in a planter, also a fig tree, and my question is, what happens if I don't prune them? Is it okay to just leave them like that without pruning?
If you don't know what to do, you're probably better off not to prune at all.
Okay.
It's perfectly fine to wait a year.
Okay. Do I have to do it every year? The fig tree and the Fijoya, does it have to be pruned every year?
So which tree is it?
A Fijoya tree and a like a, how do you say?
The Joa?
Joa? I don't know. It's a tropical fruit. It looks like a kiwi. You open it, you can eat it from like that, or just eat the whole fruit.
Grows really well here. It
Offhand,
grows really well here.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's okay. What about the fig tree? Does it have to be pruned every year?
All of these trees should be pruned every year. And your tropical trees don't have the typical seasons, so I cannot indicate where they bear or how, but they're best off when you keep the tree within bounds. Yes. Yes.
When you plant trees in an orchard like this, fairly close to each other,
Yes.
are there certain trees that shouldn't go next to each other? Like, I mean, mixing different types of trees? I don't know, like an avocado tree and a citrus tree shouldn't be next to each other or something like that?
Not that we know of,
Okay.
but we really don't know how much trees want to work together. We know some trees leave each other at a distance. Other trees want to work together, have their roots intermingle. So I'm not aware that there is trees that you should not or that don't like being together, but we don't know enough.
Are like trees, so if you have different kinds of citruses together, are they more likely to produce more fruit if they're close to each other, or that doesn't matter either?
They, like trees, are more likely to cooperate underground, and therefore you will see more results above ground. Yes.
Okay.
We now know a lot more about trees that support each other in forest settings. We know very little about trees in garden settings. So we're still trying to figure that out.
Okay.
Yes?
When you're deciding how far apart to plant two trees, should you factor in how big you think it'll grow on top, or more like the root system?
It's your individual preference. These trees at some 10 feet apart or so, that's kind of pushing it in being very close together. You can do it, but you have to prune more. They could have been planted at twice that distance, and you would have had less to worry about. So it's your individual preference. But I've seen people who plant their trees even closer together. There's people who plant fruit hedges, whereby typically one species, but say an apple or a pear, planted at 3 or 4 feet apart in a long hedge row. It's fine. If you have the space, you're probably best off giving the trees a little bit more extra room. If you want everything, then you put them closer together. Yes.
So I don't have I only have gardens in pots.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendation as far as to what kind of trees will do better in pots versus others?
Every tree will eventually outgrow its pot.
Okay.
That's a given.
Mm-hmm.
But some, I have seen some of the smaller citrus, the kumquats, do marvelously fine for many years. Whereas other trees like a persimmon are very abundant and want a lot of real estate and probably would not be happy in a pot for a long time.
So since you mentioned the kumquat, I have a kumquat tree. It's been, I don't know, maybe 8 years.
Yes.
That gave me fruit. So now all of a sudden the fruits are this. It's from the probably from the grafting.
Yes.
So I have like two big, I don't know, lime kind of fruits on it, and then some kumquats on it. Have you seen things like that before?
Usually when you see different fruits, it is because the rootstock is taking over. So the tree, it was grafted on a different type of citrus, which is now reasserting its rights or preferences, and your best bet is to cut it off altogether unless you want that rootstock to start fruiting.
All right, thanks.
Another thing you can do when you have trees in pots, it takes a lot of work, but it is what the Japanese do with their trees in pots. You lift the whole rootstock out of the pot, you shave half an inch off all the way around, you put new soil in, and you put the tree back.
I did that.
You do that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any more questions? What if we take